So I also have been defending myself for the last 24 months that the reason why no one laughed at my jokes or my presentation is because everyone was on mute. So if I get the same reaction today, then it's hard to let green cheese right.
It's funny you mentioned that because I just got something in the chat. I had muted the level of activity, so I would like to welcome you again. And I would also like to thank Jeff and Samus for arranging everything. Thank you, those zooming in.
Yeah, put the last sign up.
There we go. So it's very fitting that you started on that story. So floor is yours.
Thank you. So allow me to introduce myself. My name is Ho Yen. I am a CMHC account manager supporting the full Central and Eastern Ontario markets. I actually have the absolute pleasure of supporting great partners of CIBC and also support the largest portfolio in Canada. So today I'm very privileged today to actually give you a little bit of the housing market update in terms of some of the information that we find here at CMHC and also with our partners. So I'll make sure that if you have any questions, we'll take them up at the very end for yourselves. Now, before I get there, I do want to first talk about what something has been CMHC is working tremendously hard on. And the reason why we're working so hard is because we actually set ourselves a very bold aspiration. Now, the aspiration we set here is that by 2030, everyone in Canada has a home that they can afford and that meets their needs. Especially during the last couple of years, affordable housing continues to be a very big concern for a lot of Canadians. Now, how we play part here at CMHC is that we lead the national housing strategy. For some of you that you may know, it's actually a 10-year, $70 billion investment to not just be tackling affordable housing, but also tackle other issues that exist in the housing continuum. So you can actually say, just for example, barely. So in this case, it's like homeless and emergency shelters, and the transitional or supportive housing. So not only we want to make sure that the resources that we get gets allocated in the right places, we also want to let you know that all the premium dollars that we receive at CMHC, it gets reinvested back into the strategy. Now, for those of you who've been working or following CMHC for the last couple of years, this is probably not the first time you've heard about our aspiration, but in this case, this might be the first time you actually know we have a climate aspiration as well. Now, our climate aspiration that we set here is that by 2050, Canadian homes and communities are climate compatible and resilient. As we continue to fight climate change, we do want to make sure that we protect our homes and communities in Canada, which is why what we did at CMHC last year is that we have launched a brand new division and actually to be looking at any grants, programs, or any incentives to be initiating your clients to be looking at their homes or communities and make them more energy efficient and also more climate compatible. Has anyone here actually have heard of a program that was just launched a couple months ago called the Canada's Greener Home Loan Program? So that program was actually just launched in late June of this year, 2022. We partnered with Natural Resource Canada to actually be adding on top of the Canada's Greener Home Grant Program, which means it's up to $40,000 of interest-free loans up to 10 years for anyone who wants to make any eligible retrofits. So in this case, if you're looking in terms of anything like that, you can go to our website and actually see what are some eligibility criteria, and that's already currently available for funding, and this is a partnership we have with Natural Resource Canada. So now, getting to the housing market update, and I'm probably going to say this before I get into all this information, despite the fact that my mom tells me that I'm great at everything that I do, forecasting the housing market is unfortunately not one of them. So in this case, all this information, as I remind you again, it is from CMHC and our partners. So if you have any questions, I'll make sure I try my best to dissect this information for yourselves. Now, just based on conversation that I've heard for the last couple of minutes, I probably can assume I'm not the first person to tell you that the housing market in the last couple of months has not been as active as for the last couple of years. And a lot of those putting that is because of rising interest rates. Now, obviously, with rising interest rates, it is a major factor that impacts the housing market, but it's not the only factor you want to take into consideration. The three factors we want to discuss here is first the key policy rate, number two, the inflation rate, and third, the unemployment rate. First off, with the key policy rate, as many of you know, last month in September, Bank of Canada has increased it by 75 basis points, has now increased that policy rate to about 3.25%. Now, many of you know when it comes to the key policy rate over here, we can already know that the US side has also increased their federal rate also at 75 basis points as well. Now, with that said, because of that increase in the US and because our economy is so intertwined, it's likely we'll see that Bank of Canada will likely increase the rate to 3.5 or higher, depending on what the economy and inflation looks like in the next couple of months. In this case, a lot of economists would agree when it comes to the neutral key policy rate, which means that it is keeping the balance of market state, usually hovers at a 2.5 to 3% rate, which means it's not high enough to actually contract the economy, nor that it's low enough to stimulate the economy itself. So in this case, we do expect gradual easing in the later months or years or so, but in this particular case, we do expect because of the rising interest rates at 3.5%, this likely will mean that the GDP will be at 3.4% this year and likely contract to 0.7 next year. Does anyone here know how to define a recession or when a country is able to call themselves in a recession? There's no bad guesses. Not the easiest answer to answer.
It's so many quarters in a row that there's.
Quarters in a row? That's absolutely right. If it's 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth, then by definition, usually that's called a recession. Because of the contraction of GDP, we likely would expect that by Q4 this year and Q1 next year will be the 2 consecutive quarters. It's likely that we're going to see a very mild recession. Is there going to be a recession? I absolutely don't know. How long the recession is going to be, I absolutely also don't know. And let's be honest, if I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't be doing this presentation today. However, in this case, with this information we have, we do want to make sure that the Bank of Canada, the reason why they're increasing this interest rate is to want to keep the inflation at bay and post about 2% target. In this case, with this strategy, it's likely to be reached at late next year, 2023, or as late as early 2024. Now, speaking of inflation, the other thing we also want to examine, this is the data provided to us just last month, is going to be the 7% inflation rate. Now, excluding gasoline, it's going to be at 6.3%. Now, with inflation, I'm sure a lot of you guys already have seen a lot of prices and goods already increasing. In this case, I divided into 2 different categories. One is going to be the cost of living, the other is cost of ownership. First one here being groceries, and I'm sure a lot of you went to your favorite grocery store have already realized a lot of products have already increased in pricing. In this case, the index has actually increased almost close to 11%. And if you worked in the food supplying industry, that actually would know a lot of the prices that you see in the grocery stores right now actually don't reflect on what the prices are going to look like in the next couple of months. Sorry, what was your name?
Laura.
Thank you. So in this case, Laura, let's say you want to sell me pasta, and I am a supermarket that wants to distribute those products. And you're selling to me for, let's say, $2 a bag. In this case, I'm going to say, you know what, you're going to make all the profits with $2. I'm going to sell it at my supermarket for $2. In this case, usually with a lot of these contracts, it does not get renewed until the new calendar year. So let's say now to $3 to make the same bag of pasta, I'm still going to sell it for $2 until the contract is able to be renewed. So in this case, when you're looking at this index over here, once the new year comes along, you might come to me, Laura, and say, you know what, I want to sell to $4 because I took a loss. So a lot of these products that you see at the index at 11% does not include those products. So we do anticipate that percentage to be higher. Number 2, for those who love to travel, you probably also can see that a lot of your airfare has been more expensive. In this case, about 25% more expensive. In this case, because of a lot of flight cancellations and labor shortage. But also, if you're staying at a hotel or an Airbnb, price has also gone up roughly about 33% for those accommodations. Now, the other side, which is going to be the cost of home ownership, you're going to see that for just owning the home itself, it's gone a little bit more expensive at about 6.6%. For those who are actually wants to repair the homes as well, it's currently about 8.4% because, again, with cost of materials and also cost of labor. Last is also not for folks who are currently purchasing, also for renting. Overall in Ontario, we have seen an increase in rent as well, about 6.4%. Now, another question for all of you here, and this is only a yes or no answer. Do you think Bank of Canada looks at this percentage of 7% to determine their interest rate strategy? Do you think it's yes, or do you think it's no? You can do a vote.
Yes.
Yes? Who thinks it's no? Okay, the answer to this is yes, and actually no. Yes, because this inflation actually gives you a good idea of what folks like us, like consumers, actually would experience. However, Bank of Canada actually uses something called a core inflation rate, which is only actually 5.22%, which is going to be things that are not as volatile included in that percentage itself. So when I say the 2% target is not the 7% we're looking at here, it's going to be based on the core inflation, which is only at 5.22. So if you know that percentage and you know that core inflation, likely getting to 2% is not as far as you think. The last way to examine is unemployment. And this data just came out a few days ago. In this case, we went from 4.9 to 5.4 to now 5.2, which is not very surprising because now when school's starting, we see a lot more jobs going to be in education. But unfortunately, the one thing we are very concerned is the drop in construction. In this case, it is going to be adding a lot of stress to our infrastructure in Ontario. Second of all, we're also seeing that now hybrid work continues to increase. In this case, for all of you in the room here, this actually could be a great opportunity for you to actually investigate, because when you see more hybrid work or people going back into the office, you're likely going to see more people gravitating back towards city centers or purchasing homes with the city centers. Whereas if you see more big companies going more remote, then in this case, you'd likely see the similar trend we saw in the last couple of years, where people move outside of these city centers or more to the rural areas. Now, in this case, for unemployment, because we expect contraction of the GDP itself, which means unemployment will likely continue to increase. Unfortunately, with the interest rate at about 2.5% or higher, we likely expect by the early next year, it is going to be roughly about 7%. Do you have a question, sir?
Yeah, okay. How come there's so much sign for hire work? It looks like there's shortage of people.
Yeah, so if you examine actually unemployment rate and the data that they provide on a monthly basis, the one that just came out actually would examine what are the areas that are adding more jobs, what are the jobs that are still very vacant, and what are the jobs that are in current shortage. So construction is a big thing right now. They are in high demand, and right now not a lot of people are actually going for those roles, similar to retail. Retail is another one where right now they're going into the holiday season. You likely will see a little bit less unemployment because of adding more seasonal workers, but in this case, the demand itself is not very high. So compared to the other things that we are in demand, there's not a lot of attention, whereas for those who want those jobs don't have a lot of vacancies at the moment. So it depends on the industry that you're looking at, but in this case, overall, we're seeing that 5.2% is what we're standing at, and likely going to trend higher slowly rather than very rapidly, because you are creating layoffs from a lot of big companies. I hope that answers your question. So now, that was a lot of problems that we just discussed in the first 10 minutes, but in this case, we still have some gaps that we actually have to address, especially in our market here in Canada. First of all, when you're looking in terms of one big gap we see here at CMHC, is that we actually saw that we partnered with Finance Canada and forecast by the year of 2031 for us to achieve affordability, we need to build at least 3.5 million new homes by then. And for us to get to that point, we have to basically make sure that we have to start right here and right now, and it does need to be a collective and collaborative effort. Now, with just the 3.5 million I see here, Ontario by itself actually needs more than 50% of that. It's actually about 1.85 million units. Now, in this case, so please make sure that for 1.85 million, it's not going to all go towards the market housing, because we just briefly talked about the housing continuum. There are other needs that we also need to service based on the housing continuum. Second of all, we've also found a slightly worrying trend is that last year alone, we found that over 60% of the household disposable income is actually going towards housing costs. I'm not just talking about those who are paying a CIBC mortgage or property tax or any utilities. I'm also talking about those who are currently renting are now putting more of their disposable income into the actual housing cost itself. But in this case, you can start to see with the cost of inflation, a lot of Canadians are really starting to feel the financial stress. Last but not least, when you're looking in terms of the last thing we are very concerned with, is actually we saw historical low levels of productivity when it comes to in construction. Now, CMHC here, we obviously didn't go out there and start to monitor all these construction workers and see how much of a busy bee they were. But in this case, we're also looking in terms of more so how much construction workers are working on one particular unit. When you're looking at Ontario itself, it's going to be on historical average. We're looking at the last 2 decades at about 6.6 workers per unit. In this case, all-time low is actually reached about 3.8 workers, which is unfortunately the number just last year. This is actually something that we see in the trend across many provinces as well, in Quebec and BC. The only one we don't see this current trend is actually the province of Alberta, which in this case, they're staying at a relatively level on the historical average. Now, in the short run here, we do have to anticipate when it comes to a lot of things that we are seeing the issues in the housing supply market, in this case with labor shortages, with rising material costs and increasing financing costs. This is something that we'll likely see in the short run, that new constructions will continue to be disrupted. The second thing we also want to talk about when it comes to specifically in Ontario alone, we also have a projection up to 2030 is that we actually are likely to see, even though we are aspiring to get to the 1.85 million units, we unfortunately likely, in the best case scenario, still may not actually make that target itself. In this case, this chart over here is based on the household projections, meaning that immigration target, immigration itself, or just regular households would actually see that even if we strive to get to 2030, we're still 12.8 thousand units lower in the best case scenario, whereas other provinces in the next 3 big provinces will still likely to see growth. Now, in this case, we're thinking, what can we do at CMHC and also our partners to actually make this situation better? First of all, we actually want to provide more incentives and also education for the people in the trades. When it comes to the actual construction itself, you're actually seeing a lot of construction workers are in the older side of the range, are likely going to retire in the next decade or so, whereas the younger folks who are now finishing school or now getting into the market itself are actually not looking into construction. So providing the right education and initiatives can really help in this situation. Second of all, also want to look at immigration programs. As many of you know, that immigration is a big thing here in Canada, and immigration targets are very high. So when we have specific programs that target any skilled trade workers are coming from different countries, this can actually expedite a lot of the stress we're seeing in the labor market right now. Last but not least, also with fair compensation. Many of you know construction is unfortunately not very easy work. In this case, being compensated fairly, also protecting them with benefits and a pension, something could be extremely incentivizing those who want to get into the trades itself. Now, another thing they're actually currently working on at CMHC is through innovation. One of the things that we are working specifically on is actually expanding the actual housing supply without actually mitigating the new use of new land. So now the next few months, or maybe in the next few years, you're likely to see a lot more of these projects are actually being looked into. First of all, to actually having a mixed use between residential and commercial and mitigate the use of new land. One of them, the actually ideas that are currently being started, is actually putting condominium units or rental communities on top of major shopping malls. Has anyone here actually heard of the most recent program that got approved but are just waiting for permits, to be clear? No? Okay. So this is actually under Oxford Properties. So the folks who currently manage Square One Yorkdale, and also the Scarborough Town Center, they're just waiting for permits to be cleared, but they already have actually projects and construction in place to actually be starting these constructions in the next couple of years. So in this case,
65 stories high.
exactly, 30, 50 to 65, I believe that's the number. So in this case, you can see, these are some of the things that we are doing to adding more density in the right places without actually going through all the permit and actually reconstruction process. Second of all, is also looking at existing parking lots to be converted into actual buildings itself. In Toronto, there's a lot of use when it comes to like Toronto, Etobicoke, Mississauga, and also with Scarborough, where there's a lot of parking lots that are not being fully utilized. So converting them into mixed use will also be a great use of the land itself and more opportunities for yourself as real estate agents. So I'm also not going to get into the full numbers here because I know you likely know right now the current real estate numbers, but in this case, there's a trend that we actually are currently seeing right now in Toronto, and this includes Ajax and Pickering, is that a lot of the sales right now are actually going towards apartment buildings and a little bit less towards single detached homes. I'm not saying at all that single detached is losing its flavor or losing its attraction at all, because there's still a lot of folks that want to aspire to get those properties. However, in the last couple of months, especially up to August this year, we actually see that just by percentage, a lot more people are purchasing apartments, maybe due to affordability, or when we talk about the hybrid work, where more people are now gravitating back towards city centers. So in this case, we still have a lot of data to support this current trend. We are seeing just the last couple of months, there are more apartment sales in comparison to single detached itself. But then again, when you're looking at this itself, it's not saying that there are going to be a favor towards the other, but in this case, you can see almost a 5% change when it comes to the apartments in yellow, going away from the blue, which is going to be the single detached homes. So one last thing I do want to first talk about is going to be the multi-property owners, and this is something that for the last couple of years, we actually have worked with TerraNet to actually do an analyzation of what the most active participants looked like in the last couple of years. So above first-time home buyers were actually the multi-property owners, which means that folks have at least 2 properties under their names or more. In this case, we actually found that in Toronto itself, it's placed 4th place. First place was actually in London, the Middlesex area at 33%. Second and third is actually going to be in the Parry Sound, Muskoka, which is very obvious because with the vacation and rental homes itself. Number 4 at 29% was Toronto. Now, the thing we actually found to be the most interesting statistic is that over 70% of these multi-property owners actually own them in the same region itself, which means if Laura is purchasing a property in Toronto, a second property in Toronto, there's a very good chance that the first property is in Toronto as well. So, and you've also looked at the profile itself, we also found that even though they do spread in range in terms of ages, we found that the most active ones are between 44 to 51 years old. So if you're speaking to a new client who are looking to purchase, let's say, investment property or third property and such, there's probably a good chance that the properties are going to be the same areas, and this could be a good opportunity for you to look further into. Last but not least, when it comes to all this information, unfortunately, there are going to be other things that is going to be outside of Bank of Canada's control, but we also have to be keeping in mind. First of all, when it comes to any further geopolitical tensions, and also what could increase debt levels and also with commodity prices, with the unfortunate events happening in Russia and Ukraine right now, a lot of times that we do see now with the price of wheat and other things are increasing because of the global geopolitical tensions. Number two, recurring COVID outbreaks, in this case may prolong into the supply chain disruptions and also with the immigration levels. In this case, when we're looking at China with a zero COVID policy, but also the impact to travel, because again, we talked about that immigration is a huge part of Canada. We have to make sure that if there's going to be reoccurring COVID outbreaks, that's going to be impacting our housing market as well. Last but not least is that homeownership could decline further when it comes to more than what we expect in the new year, in this case because of cost of living and also cost of borrowing. So in this case, if you do have a client that wants to hold a great interest rate for their mortgages, I know one person here called Jack who would likely to help you with this as well. Now, that's what me talking about for a full 20 minutes probably, and then look at the time, but in this case, do you have any questions about what I talked about or even just in relation to CMHC? Yes, sir. Oh, sorry.
Coming out of COVID, where does the immigration, what are they projecting for immigration into, I would say Canada, but most of it would be into Ontario, I think, over the course of the next couple of years?
Sorry. The immigration targets are currently being revised because the immigration targets were first set by the federal government. It was first at 425,000 per year, reaching to 450,000 by 2024. Because of COVID and restriction of travel for a lot of countries, that is going to be revised in the new year on the next federal budget, which is April of 2023. So in this case, when you're looking at the realistic numbers of what we have, the census didn't give us that number when it comes to how many immigrants have already arrived in the country during the pandemic, but that number and the goal would be revised based on what we saw and also what we would anticipate in the next 2 years, because now the Liberal government is now in the House until 2025. So that would be revised, but in this case, it will be later on during the new year, between January and probably March.
Do they suspect that would be higher than the four?
Yeah, like
Than
the examination that I
425 to make up for the COVID time that they did shut down a lot of the immigration?
I think it's also looking in terms of the geopolitical issues that are happening in the world. When you're looking at Canada, it's a relatively safe place to live and also a great place to start. There is going to be a lot of attention when it comes to the first immigration. The one thing that FinTrack actually has done a really good job is looking at assets being moved over from foreign countries to Canada. And there was a report earlier last year that has indicated over billions of dollars have now been migrated actually to Canada. So in this case, we do anticipate that influx. So in this case, not just because of the target, it's because of a lot of things happening in the world. Canada does remain one of the most popular destinations compared to others.
Is our housing going to be able to accommodate the numbers that the government is going to
Truth be told, no. Can we get there and try our best? Absolutely. Right now, we're projecting about 450,000 units per year in just Ontario. And based on the labor shortages and all the constraints that we're working with, it's extremely difficult. Does that mean we stop? No, we don't. But in this case, we have to work partners with investors, not just the public government. It has to be with private as well.
Condo.
Well, that's only one option, right? At the end of the day, like, people have different perspectives on the type of housing. Sometimes, you know, the single detached, there's benefits, pros and cons. There are also pros and cons for apartments as well.
We have an area in the Pickering area or in the Durham area where over the course of the next, I don't know, 8 to 10 years, there's 70 condos to be built. And people are questioning the government regarding this, but they're gonna have no choice. They allow for, 450,000 here just into Ontario. What are we gonna do?
Yeah, there's also a program that's currently started for Innovation Fund is actually with the rent to own, which means that people who are not able to purchase to begin with are renting. They usually get a lease agreement for 3 to 5 years, depending on how much additional rent that they're paying going into down payment. And at the end of the lease agreement, they have the ability to purchase the home as the stated price at the beginning of the lease agreement. And that itself can actually be helping a little bit as well when it comes to the rents versus purchase. Yeah, but that's something that's just primary. Yes.
Is there going to be some pressure or on to, I know the city of Toronto has been more proactive with this, but the outer areas of GTA on legalizing secondary units. I know in our area, there are little town, like Whitby is ridiculous in trying to legalize a secondary unit. They have so many hoops and, it's almost impossible. Is there gonna be pressure from CMHC and the government to these smaller communities to start allowing it? And, because that's an immediate open for secondary units.
Yeah, and I think the one trend you likely would have seen the last couple of years is that because of these likely to look at multi-generational households, because again, if you have folks that are unfortunately able to not accommodate one homeowner for one unit itself, that's likely going to be the situation that is going to likely happen. The most recent federal budget has announced that they were going to support overall in Canada, it's going to be building a second unit, could be their backyard or somewhere, that actually legalizing that unit for them to either live in or to sell for actually a rental property itself. So is there pressure? Absolutely. But in terms of like the actual programs that we're able to allow that to have, and based on how much land that each property has, because that likely will be the more single detached like properties that can use that legal second unit, that would be something that we have to probably look a little more closely into. But then again, for an opportunity, that could be a great opportunity for you to be looking at one big property, but also have a secondary unit that you can also use for rental income as well.
Just as a one-off, you guys can add the pressure. However, if the municipality has ridiculous rulings that will not be flexible in any way, aside by safety and whatever, that's something you guys should look into, because there is some little kingdoms around here that are absolutely ridiculous with their ruling. Like, you can't do it because your driveway is 6 inches bigger than what it should be.
Right.
And they stop it when it's illegal. It could be 3 separate units there. And I really think that's an immediate for CMHC to increase some of it, if they can go around to the municipalities and take a look at some of their criteria and maybe give some assistance to what their guidance should be.
Right.
Because I do know, and a lot of it, people in this area and this Durham region will tell you that we have some real ridiculous rulings for our secondary units, and clearing that up instantly gives you double the housing.
Yeah, and that's the thing we were talking about when we said we have to make sure it's a collective effort, because CMHC, we are a federal crown corporation, to work with a municipality or provincially. It needs to be something that we would put in priority for allowing existing land to be used first before we use new land to build.
Okay.
So that's something that we have to put together to do so.
Yeah.
But I'll bring that back to my
Yeah,
my
absolutely, because I do know we have a lot of silly little rules that are not, I mean, of course, safety and that kind of stuff is priority, but I'm talking about.
But it makes it difficult to actually find legal units when you're working with other clients. A lot of the units are and crazy illegal things, you can, little windows this big, how is somebody ever gonna get out of it? Those are obvious safety things that need to be there, but there's no incentive to make a unit legal because it is so onerous to do so.
There's also a lot of decision making towards also how popular that municipality is. The more north and the more east you go, you likely would see those cities or municipalities have more programs and incentives to be trying to make the place a little bit better for them to stay and to work and grow the municipality itself. For an area like Durham, with extreme popularity, you might see a little bit more pushback than the other areas. Like, so if you look at Simcoe has a forgivable grant that is up to 20 years for existing down payments for I think 5 or 10%. And if they live there for 20 years, that becomes forgivable. And you don't see that in Toronto or in unfortunately Durham. Because
could you run by that again? Could you just run by that last?
That forgivable grant.
Yeah, so basically so when you apply for the county of Simcoe County, and basically when you are going to be living in a property in that region, you can apply as a first-time home buyer and basically say that you are going to use their home ownership assistance. So they give you 5 or 10% as a loan to begin with if you're going to stay in that home less than 20 years. it is over 20 years and it comes forgiven. It's actually on their municipal website.
Wow.
How many municipalities in Ontario have this? Sorry to interrupt.
I only think for ones that we support, there's about 5 of them. There's 2 up north, 1 to east, and 2 out west. I don't remember the ones out west, probably closer to Sarnia or probably Middlesex area, like more on the west side. But for north is Simcoe County, and also if you go up north to Thunder Bay, there's also another one.
If I read about that, was that also put them on title until it's paid?
That would be a second position mortgage.
I guess so, that's what it was. I remember reading when it came out and I read, okay, then they're on title.
But it gets discharged
Yeah.
once the 20 years up.
Super incentive.
That's amazing.
Yeah, but there's also because if you look at Simcoe County, they don't have a big population.
Nobody wants to be
Durham,
there.
Toronto.
Barrie was
Yeah, so there's.
Oh, yes.
rated one of the 10 best places to live. Barrie was not so long ago, but one of the busiest markets, so I guess we explain
Who
more.
went crazy there, yeah.
But Simcoe County also would be a little bit more in terms of very north as well, right? Like there'll be more towards the Wasaga and then a little bit to the Barrie side as well. That's like the region that they serve.
We're seeing much more multifamily dwellings also as well, much more than we used to.
Like 5 plus units or like or 2
Well,
plus,
just
like 4.
Multiple family, just families all bunching together.
Multi-generational.
Affordability. We're seeing it much more in the last 4 to 5 years than we saw in the previous 10.
Creative, being creative.
You can look at UK, they have like century-old amortization. They basically just have families live there and they just keep paying the mortgage because it's just so expensive. But also they know that family members are going to stay there and live together. So obviously we don't want to put like a family of 6 in like 1,000 square feet because again, we have so much land, but in this case, like we also don't want to put that pressure in the homeowners as well, right? So we have to make sure there is enough space at the secondary unit to make sure that we can mitigate that too. So it also has to make sure they're safe and also make sure they're safe.
I'm not sure that that's a federal thing, Laura, more than a provincial thing, that the provincial
It's a
government.
municipal,
It's a
thing,
municipal
and the only way to correct it
Control
is
the
that,
municipality governments, and I think they started really doing it and giving the mayors much more power over the course of even the last 2 weeks. That they can veto decisions and make, they don't have to go to, 10 people in their chair, they can, the mayors can make more. I know they can in Toronto or Ottawa, and it's gonna continue. That's the problem.
Yeah, we have to expedite a lot of the things that are currently into the pipeline as well, right? Because like when you have all these type of approvals and permissions, it takes a long time to do so. So when we're able to at least make that more efficient, that's the way to also do it as well.
I like the fact downtown, we were showing houses stuff down in Portugal, all that stuff. And it's great because now they attach all the approval already for the laneway housing. This is crappy, it's already been approved and all that stuff, so it's great, it's already how that's in place. So they put the report right on the listings, so you know they can do it. It's a tear down or no brush or loss.
Right, okay.
Is there ever going to be some sort of, it's not very popular here, but on resales, especially on condos, the vast majority of those units end up going to investors. And it's very difficult to get first-time home buyers into them or downsizers into them. And a lot of times that's because the agents who work with downsizers and first-time home buyers are not working with investors, so they don't get the access because they're not bringing in 10 buyers or 20 buyers at a time. And then it becomes a problem when the building's built and it's all being up for rent, or they're trying to flip them at a different price.
Silent sales stuff.
Right, so is there at some point an incentive perhaps for builders to not allow that they need to be owner occupied or have preference for owner occupancy? I've heard of a couple of builders doing that, but it seems to be very far between.
Yeah.
But to me, what it seems to be doing is actually creating a problem with housing instability, because now during the first year of occupancy, they're putting renters in there, and then because it's not covered under rent control, because it's in the unit, then they're kicking them out. So now we're actually demanding incredibly high rent. So now we're actually creating more housing instability rather than solving the problem.
Right.
So is there some program or some sort of incentive for builders so that we can have it as owner occupied units?
So to answer your question, based on from CMHC standpoint, we have 2 programs that run under the federal side, which is the seed funding and RCFI. The the difference between the two is RCFI is more towards rental buildings, whereas for seed funding is more for like purchase and market housing. The two programs are very similar when it comes to providing funding for builders or investors to actually make those projects happen with little to no interest, and also it's pretty much free money at that point. So when you look at builders that want to look at those incentives, you buy them with those first. And a lot of times when we look at a very competitive market, they rather go with private because there's a lot less regulation compared to public side. So when you're looking at that, yes, we would look into that. We have something in place that are like that, but also when it comes to how many builders actually will take advantage of that versus those who want to go with just investors, it's not, the ratio is definitely not favorable to us. So because again, when you're going with public funding, there's going to be a lot of regulations.
Well, of course there is, so that's, I guess that's more what my question is that are you looking at a way in the future to make that more of an incentive to have them as owner occupied? Maybe not.
Because the thing is, I work with my research and policy team very closely, and I know that that's not the highest priority they have, right?
Okay.
But I
It's
know
basically, I'm seeing
it's on the agenda, if I can give you that much information.
Thank you,
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Yeah, but that's something, again, like I understand where they're going, especially with the secondary units, like that's something I know we have to be addressing very soon.
Okay, thank you.
Just want to make sure that anybody who's joining us via Zoom, if they had any questions for Ho-Yen as well, just open your mic up and go right ahead if you do.
Lindsay, ask away.
No? And I have a couple of pages. You do, Laura?
I do.
Volunteers.
The other thing is the federal government going to do anything with these consortiums of investment buyers that get together and purchase real estate as an investment tool and then turn around and rent it out? Because that's also been a real difficulty for people who are wanting to get into the rental market, and you've got this group of people who own quarter of the units in a condo, and they're basically setting the price. So that's unfair to the first-time home buyers getting into the marketplace, or even the people who want to rent. It's making it very adverse to them, and it's really increased a lot of the base price of the rentals.
Yeah.
Is there anything in place to deal with these kind of investment consortiums?
This year's federal budget, there wasn't anything included other than the one that was trying to ban foreign investors from purchasing Canadian property for investments for 2 years, so that's already been in place.
Yeah.
Outside of that, not domestically yet. You guys probably have heard also last year there was a group that wanted to almost buy $1 billion worth of real estate and basically try to make it their own. I think that might be the one that we were discussing of. So that was one thing we were very concerned with as well, because that basically just controlling the market and having leadership over it.
Absolutely.
So this year's federal budget, from what I've understood, there's no funding or direction provided yet. But then again, like I can only really speak to what's provided in funding and what's being in discussion.
Okay.
But yeah, but again, like I will make sure I usually do these presentations quite often. So generally, if there's any updates, I will come back and usually talk about them.
Perfect.
Anyways. I'll make sure it goes.
There was just one observation that I had that hasn't kind of been touched on, because the housing supply issue has been, like, we've been dealing with this for years. We knew it was coming to a pretty close breaking point. But the client base that I tend to deal with now are those that have that 2,700 square foot house with 4 bedrooms and 1, possibly 2 at most, if those bedrooms are truly occupied. Kids have moved on, that kind of thing, but there's no place for them to go. There isn't sort of that suitable alternative that isn't a condo necessarily, but is a bungalow community, a bungalow townhome, bungalow semis, those kinds of things. There's a real lack of that from a product standpoint, in my opinion, particularly out in this area here. And so there's no incentive for them to go. They own their house outright. It is more house than they need, but it's still manageable, but they jump at the opportunity to downsize to a suitable product. So it's sort of like this odd other missing middle kind of.
That's more like municipality work too, right? When
Yeah.
you're looking at just the regulation, like if you look at Trenton, which is like a military town, they have a lot of flat smaller old homes.
Yeah.
They can't build high rises because again, like it's
Right.
a military base.
Right.
So in this case, when you're looking at terms of those bungalows, smaller properties that are more suitable for those who may not need that 2,700 square footage like
Right.
properties anymore, that's something that has to be municipality regulated, and depends on also, if you go to Atlantic, you'll see a ton of those like areas, and because again, they have a lot more mobile and manufactured homes as well. So that's where innovation comes into play, where if the municipality is entertaining those as legal units, and also with how much land they're able to provide to let those construction like this, like here, right now, a lot of them are looking at mixed use because they don't want to sacrifice the business side of things as well as
Right.
generating profit for the city itself. So it's a tough line to go when you try to build these minimum bungalows. It almost you're basically not adding enough density to the land that we
Right.
capture. So
Right.
it's tough, but also we know demographically, more people are getting to the age where they may start looking at those options. So when we look at census data, that's another thing we also have to take into consideration, because a lot of people are going to likely retire in the next like decade or so. And that's probably a need that we have to also address within the housing continuum. And that's from retirement housing and also supportive housing and transition housing. That's the three within the scope of this way we're talking.
Yeah, it's a real chicken or egg conundrum, isn't it? Because they won't move, so they're not freeing up the inventory for it to come to market for those to buy because there's no place. And people are likely to stay local, right? I mean,
Right,
this
they
is
don't
where
wanna
your
move to
family.
Colbert, they don't wanna move to Trenton, they wanna
Yeah.
stay where their family is.
Like rural housing might be another option too, because Ottawa's doing something like that. Like rural housing means getting a lot of popularity. It's small, but larger than.
But stairs.
I know, yeah. But the density and the
Yeah.
size needed is a lot better than if you're looking at just like a bungalow.
But if you're talking
Old
like condo
people.
bungalows that are,
I know.
because they got them in Niagara on the Lake, linked condo bungalows is really like, you can do fairly you would do as dense as a townhouse complex, you just don't have the vertical height.
I mean, there's a couple of pockets, right? There's one in Oshawa off of Wilson Road, I would say.
They got a couple
Ritson?
of Brandon too.
Yeah.
there's a couple
Oh, yeah,
of
there's
Brandon.
definitely.
Yeah.
And Swan Lake and
Yeah, so but there's not an abundance, there's certainly not an abundance of that.
I also feel like that would be a very attractive purchase for first time homeowners to just start off like a starter
Yeah.
home. So I think like the idea would be very good if we want to start looking at those regulations and say, you know what, this could be actually a good buying opportunity, but then again, not being gobbled up by investors is another story. Right? So
Yeah.
for sure.
yeah, a lot of things that we can do, but unfortunately, there's a lot of things we have to consider before we make that
Yeah,
decision too. You win some of those. Yeah, fortunately.
Is there anybody else?
Am I okay with time?
You're great for time.
Yeah, when are you taking us from?
Oh, a little bit.
Sorry, we didn't tell the people.
The company mentioned Wilmslow Malls, Oxford. Yeah, so the approvals they're waiting for, are they to build on those existing malls or, yeah?
Permits, yeah, so we went for permits to build. So basically, once they have permits cleared, they basically are building on top. Because they already have the infrastructure plans from the actual mall itself, so they just want to, the first actually, idea actually came from Promenade Mall. It's actually close to the mall, that was actually the first idea that they had, which is actually leaving Promenade as it is, selling the land to an investor, and they built up top. But then they didn't have enough funding, which is why it actually fell off, and Promenade just stayed as Promenade Mall as it is. But that was actually the first project in discussion to build condos instead of breaking down the mall itself, because it still retains good value, it's a great area to be in. So they're just waiting for that to finish, but the infrastructures were in place, they can just build that on top.
I was amazed they did that in North Toronto Collegiate in my old neighborhood, and
Oh.
they built the condo on top of the high school.
Mm.
Now, wow, that's pretty wild. So,
Yeah.
it's amazing.
Wait, those high school kids don't even need a coat.
Yeah.
Exactly, it won't, it can't be late.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
And you know, the closest are usually late, I remember. I lived the furthest away, and I was always there before they
it takes me 3 minutes to get down.
There's a massive building to go in Yorkville too.
Yeah.
Yorkville is a massive, unbuilt, to go on top of it. Just don't put it in the parking lot.
That's what they did at Pickering.
No one's gonna be able to afford cars, so.
How did you
To
consider that
You get a car or you get.
everybody drives a car now, so you have a couple, you need 2 parking spaces, but for a one bedroom, you don't get any parking spaces.
Like if a Toronto situation where you sell the home and the parking spot separately.
Separately.
Yeah, so,
And the locker.
yeah, so that's why the density needs to be correct. You can't just build like 180 stories above a shopping mall, because there's still commercial use.
Well, there's some that have the cars you can rent, that they have like 6 parking spots in the unit that you just have your rentals, so they're already available for whatever, it's not Uber before, what were those called?
Yeah,
Where they rent-
electric, or the rental
So
car.
the reason
Yeah,
why,
car share,
the
yeah.
reason why they also are more mindful of shopping malls, because like they're usually very close to transit.
Yeah.
And the thing is, they want you to also be looking at climate
Yeah.
change and also
Yeah.
utilizing carpool situation. So if you're looking at these transit like Yorkdale, there's already a TTC there. If you're looking at Scarborough Town Center, that's a station there.
Yeah.
It's gonna be much easier to look at those options first, it's cheaper, but rather than having a car per household. So that's the assumption that they want to have, is that most people may still have a car, so they just use public transit.
Well, downtown, there's lots of neighborhoods, no parking anyway.
That's downtown.
In your house, it's not in common,
So
so
Durham,
detached house.
I live in Markham, 2 of my children have cars, I'm in a row house with 2-car garage and a parking pad, where do I put the 4th car?
That's a first world problem, Sue.
Yeah, I know.
But it is understandable though, right? Because when you're looking at a community like Toronto, where our public system is not the best in the world, it is sometimes more convenient for having, one person per car and also going to work as well. So that might be something we have to look into when it comes to like electrifying the vehicles, make sure it's more green to put more vehicles on the road itself, but also again, incentivizing public transit as well, right? So
In the
that's,
areas that it works.
yeah, because like again, if we're looking at like where I'm from in Hong Kong, like their transit system is fantastic. No one needs to drive or purchase a vehicle because it's fantastic, but the TTC,
London, yeah, we still.
Toronto, absolutely not. I wouldn't even say the same thing for RT, because that's what Hong Kong transit system is. You miss a bus, you have to be probably 30 minutes to get to another.
And you can't get anywhere on the bus without it taking you 3 hours to get there.
Exactly, yeah. That's why when we look at hybrid work, that's why it helps alleviate some of that pressure too. When you have more remote work, people don't leave the vehicles as often, and you're able to kind of put that pressure off when there's more hybrid or remote work. We can go back to the office and the same situation will happen in the next couple of years.
A lot of moving parts.
I know, there is, and that's unfortunately what we have to do. We have to prioritize what we can first and where the need sees, like where we see the need first, and that's what we prioritize that on.
We're not getting away from cars. You see the 401, they.
That's why the 407 was built.
Trying to make it wider every year. Construction out there, they're trying to add lanes.
That is
It's so hard for us in rural areas, like, well, not rural, but Durham areas, where we never were built around transit, around proper transit to move people around those cars.
Yeah.
I can't see them getting away from that in areas like this for years and years and years.
Because even like with projections, I think they're favoring the West Central Ontario to be first, because again, with the US potential highway that they are looking into is more on the west side, and again, there's more developed transit over there compared to the east. And there's a lot of, unfortunate is that because they're looking at areas that are close to like the nuclear power and also with Port Hope, where there's previous contamination, there's gonna be a lot of things that these transportations have to look into than the west side where it's just land for them to build on, right? So that is a logistic nightmare. If you take a look at the east compared to the west side, which is why demographically everyone's projecting, the Wellingtons, the Orangevilles, the KCWs to grow faster than like the east side, and in this case, like the eastern Ontario is still projected to grow really quickly, but just not as quick as the central and western sides when it comes to that demographic. Yeah, but it's gonna be very hard.
It's gonna be very hard.
Yeah.
Just trying to move around this city now, and really this province, I was in Kitchener on the weekend, and it's just horrible, the traffic, just trying to get out of there. Just ridiculous.
Spend $60 on round trip.
It's well worth it, do it all the time.
Yeah, time is money.
That only takes you so
Not
far.
60.
Right.
Yeah.
From Kitchener to rush hour maybe, if you're like, but closer to 50.
Much more gooder though.
Well, I just want to thank you so very much for your time and all the information. You did a great presentation. Really appreciate it. Perfect.
Exactly before that's actually a lot of information. And if you have any questions, ask Jack, she's the expert.
tell your mom you did okay.
Okay, yeah, slow again there.
Well, thank you again, and thank you everybody who joined us via Zoom. I will have the recording out, if you'd like to re-watch, or those that weren't able to join us. Thank you very much for allowing us to do that, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.
Nice